Every city will claim to have them, and every city will tell you that theirs is the best. Most larger places will lay claim to having quite a few. I am, of course, speaking of secret bars. The kind of bars with no name out front, where a secret password is required to get in. This is what started my obsession, and may cost me my soul. The year was 2001. I had turned 21 earlier that year and had already done up all the new freedoms that come with that age. I had done bars, casinos, you name it. At first it was pretty cool, because for years I felt like a kid, like some wet-behind-the-ears idiot that the rest of the world sort of just patted on the head. Even after turning 21, things remained annoying. People would hear that I was 21 and treat me like an adult, but as a new adult, like a grown-up that still needed grown-ups. I was annoyed. I worked downtown in a dreary office job, inputting data. The nice thing about it, though, were my hours, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. And for a single guy in his early 20s, it was perfect. I got to sleep in every day, and I would get off at work just in time to take a quick walk from the New Orleans Central Business District, cross over to Canal Street, and bam, I was right there in the French Quarter. Land of booze and women. Lots of fun times were spent down there. But as I said, even that began to get boring. Really boring. So I began to research secret bars. I found a few right away, and most of them were just as boring as the regular bars. One in particular, called Mythique, was located up a narrow stairwell, accessible only through a tiny door located under the bar downstairs. Once I got up there, though, it was just another bar. The clientele were a bit more pretentious. Most of them thought that they were the second coming of Lestat, but in the end, it was the same thing. A bar, drinks, people, and usual crappy music. I remember one night I was at home in my tiny apartment, using Metacrawler. Now, remember, this was 2001, and searching for more secrets in my city that I was now old enough to exploit. I kept finding links to the same boring places I always went to. And then my email binged. Or I should say, announced, "You've got mail." I clicked open my email and I saw the heading for the message read, "Secret Bar." Now, I was sure if I had asked anyone on my AOL buddy list for help, I didn't recognize the sender. I figured that maybe I was in a chat room one night and asked around, but I figured it was worth a check. The email was simple and short, and read something like, "Secret New Orleans Bar. Looking for a journey? Not afraid of hell? Not too shy for heaven? Then come visit us. Be in Jackson Square tonight at 2 a.m. Wear a black shirt and gray pants and have a cup of coffee in your hand. Seat yourself in the third bench. This is your only invitation. Miss it, and you will never be invited again. P.S. Come alone and tell no one." And that was the end of the email. I was lucky that my job required me to wear a suit because it just so happened that I did in fact have a pair of gray slacks. I pulled out a black t-shirt and realized that I actually looked pretty good. I figured that this could be a prank, but even if it was, even if it turned out to be nothing, I would go out and have a few drinks anyway. Hell, maybe even get laid. I didn't have to go into work the next day, so the night could turn out to be a very fun one anyway. However, I may have been a bored, idiotic 21-year-old, but I wasn't totally stupid. This could also be a trick. Maybe even a trap or something. So I called my best friend Mike up. I told him that I was going out with some strangers from work, and that I wasn't sure about them. I told him that I would call him by around 4 a.m., and if I didn't, for him to call and check up on me. I told him that I would be in the quarter. Mike had to be up at 4 a.m. anyway, so it wouldn't put him out of his way to call when he got up. And so, I left my apartment around 1:30 a.m. I only lived about 15 minutes from downtown, but I figured that I would make sure that I was on time. And by 1:55 a.m., I was sitting on the third bench in Jackson Square, sipping my coffee and waiting. At 2 a.m., the cathedral bells rang out twice, and I received a tap on the shoulder. A gorgeous woman was sitting next to me, and I thought to myself, this is too cliche to be real. To me, she seemed like a walking cliche for a hidden bar. You know, Goth girl, mid-20s, really hot. Yeah, she was from the bar. I knew it from the start. "I'm Jodie," said the woman. "Well, at least you're not Raven or Death or Lilith or some other stereotypical goth name," I replied, but I did so with a smile. She returned my smile with one of her own. "Nope, always been Jodie. And you must be Kurt, right?" She knew my name. Very cool. Of course, my name was on my AOL profile where the email was sent, so if this was her attempt at a cool trick, I was one step ahead. "Yes, Kurt. That's me. I guess you're here to show me to the secret bar," I asked. "Only if you're ready to journey to hell. Or heaven, depending on your tastes. We like to consider this to be the first back out point for new clients. You can decline the invitation now. Go home and maybe to some other bar, or wherever you'd like. Only be warned that no other invitation will come to you again." I considered this and decided that it was already after 2 a.m. I was already out, dressed and full of coffee. I wanted to see this place. "Lead on, Miss Jodie," I replied. She stood up and began to walk ahead of me, at a rapid pace, I might add. We walked in silence for some time, weaving deep into the quarter, past Bourbon Street, past all the loud and drunk tourists, past the warm and safe lights, the cop cars, and music from the bars. And before long, we were in the dark part of the quarter, mostly residential, and very few people were out on the streets this way. She suddenly stopped and walked up the stoop to a private residence. She fiddled with keys, opened the door, and gestured for me to enter. "Wait, is this someone's house?" I asked. "This is the house where the dead scream in silence, where the walls rot, where pain can become pleasure, where pleasure becomes death. This is the house of Din, he who dwells on the Black Star. Enter." I thought that was the coolest pitch for a bar that I had ever heard. I figured that it was rehearsed, but she did kind of say this whole little phrase with a lot of conviction. I had no idea who Din was, and I certainly didn't know about black stars, but I did have a desire to push on. She walked me into the house, which was empty. No furniture, no nothing. Now, French Quarter real estate isn't cheap, so if this place was renting a house just to serve as the cover for a bar, they clearly took themselves seriously. This might not be so boring after all. What happened next was strange. She turned me towards a small hallway with an elevator. Now, I know that some houses back in the day had elevators. However, this one only appeared to go down. New Orleans isn't exactly known for having basements, especially in homes. As I went to step in, she stopped me once more. "This is your second back-out chance. Same as before. You can turn around and leave. No harm, no foul." "Push the button," I replied, pointing at the down button, and stepped in. The elevator ride felt long. Really long. At first I was thinking that this was impossible. No one builds down in this city. Hell, we even have to bury our dead above ground. As far as I could see though, we were going down. This was one of those older elevators with just the metal grate door. I could see wood and metal going past us, and this eventually gave way to stone. I was about to question this when it occurred to me. "Cool trick," I said. "Trick?" Jodie asked. "Yeah, the elevator is rumbling in place while a rolling graphic goes by outside to look like we're going down, right? Because while I'm no expert in elevators, I would say that we'd have to be at least 20 stories below the city right now. And I know that that just isn't possible." "You're right," she replied, grinning. "We aren't 20 stories below the city. We are, by now, at least 2,000 stories below, if you're using stories as a measurement." I wanted to say something back about how that was a lie. It had to be a lie. We hadn't been riding that long, and that amount of depth wasn't possible on a tiny elevator like this. However, I figured that this was all part of the act. like her whole speech about the House of Din and all that crap. I didn't want to become too obnoxious or pushy. She might end up asking me to leave. Figured that I would ruin the scene for other patrons. Instead, I just smiled and decided to play along with a really cool and elaborate bar scene. Fake or not, this was by far the most ambitious effort that I had ever seen put forward for a drinking establishment. Shortly after, the elevator stopped. Jodie stepped out in front of the doors, but before she opened them, she turned back to me. "This is your final chance to back out. If you wish, I will take you back. However, once I open these doors, you will be in hell. You may find your way back to the surface tonight, but some find that leaving is just impossible. Some stay forever. In the interest of free will and fair play, I am bound by the Council of Nod to offer you this final chance to return to your life. Choose now." Amazing speech, Jodie. Really great. You guys clearly put some thought into this. Yes, I want to go to this bar. And she smiled and opened the doors. A small door sat at the end of a wooden hallway that looked like it had been built around the time of the pyramids. There were no lights. I could only see by the small electric light in the elevator, and the light coming from the door ahead. I walked forward, and as soon as I stepped off of the elevator, the heat hit me. It wasn't so hot that I couldn't take it, but if anyone has ever experienced being in an attic on a really hot day with no ventilation, then you'll have an idea of how this felt. The air was thick beyond description. I instantly was covered in sweat, and I knew that if I stayed in this hallway for too long, I would pass out. I turned to look back, and I saw that the elevator had already begun heading back up. From what I could see, there was no button to call it back down either. I guess that Jodie wasn't kidding when she said that this was my last chance to back out. I crossed my fingers that the bar would be air-conditioned, and I walked forward, right there into the light. What happened over the next couple of hours is largely a blur, but I will tell it best that I can. I entered the bar. It was small, very small, about the size of a bedroom. There was a single wooden bar, 3 bar stools pushed to it, and 3 small tables in the corner area. The room was poorly lit. Only a small light bulb hanging from the cord was providing the light. However, it was well lit enough to see everything, and sitting right on the bulb seemed the most logical. There was a small shelf behind the bar. Typical setup. Liquor bottles in front of a mirror. There were 5 others in the room, plus the bartender. I saw a gothic girl sitting at one of the tables, sipping a drink with a rather plain-dressed man. There were 2 gentlemen at the other table. One was wearing a business suit, and the other was wearing that awful cowboy attire that was popular in almost all walks of life, even secret bars. There was another woman, average in appearance, probably in her mid-30s, smoking at the other side of the bar. Of course, there was me too, so that completed our little circle. There was no music playing. The walls were old wood, oak maybe. The bartender, now he was a classic. White shirt, black pants, suspenders, and bow tie. Like something out of the Roaring '20s. It was still hot too. Not as bad as the hallway, but pretty awful. Liquor would only make me hotter, but I was here now. I figured that I would test the waters. Now, as for liquor, I saw no bottles that I could recognize. None were labeled. There was no beer either. No name brands, no cash register, no bar mat. This place was as simple as you could want. And after a moment, the bartender spoke to me. "Welcome to hell," he announced, smiling. Cool name. Sorta expected it though. I tried not to sound rude or pretentious. They had put on a great show tonight. But calling the place hell? Really? Too predictable. "Well, it translates differently in lots of places. Hell is just the way that you know it. Shall I call it something else?" he asked, and he didn't seem to be joking or annoyed. "No, hell's fine. How about a drink? Jack and Coke, please," I said. "No Jack here, and no Coke either." "What do you have then?" Well, most people down here have a drink that we call regret. I can also serve you loneliness, or if you're feeling particularly bold, our house special is damnation. Wow, you guys really play up the hell thing here, huh? Okay, serve me some regret, please. He handed me a drink poured from a brown bottle, and it tasted amazing too. I figured it to be bourbon, and I wished that I had some Coke to mix with it. Apparently there was no ice here, and I chuckled. Of course not. Ice in hell. What was I thinking? The drink was tasty enough though, and the buzz hit me quick. I ordered up a loneliness and began to look around at my fellow patrons. None of them seemed to even notice me. The goth girl was cute though, so I picked up my drink and I decided to walk on over to her, when suddenly the woman sitting at the bar began to whimper. I am so thirsty. Can I please have some water? She seemed to be pleading this to the bartender. No, ma'am, he replied with the same stupid grin. No water in hell, not even a small amount. Have another cigarette, though. Wash it down with some hard liquor. No more smoking. My mouth is too dry. No more liquor. Water, please. She continued, and to me, it began to sound a lot like begging. Instead of handing her water, he held out an unlit cigarette. And it was then that I noticed the overflowing ashtray, the size of a damned punch bowl, sitting next to her. It was full of butts. Had to be over 1,000 of them in there. Had she smoked them all herself? I strained my eyes and I studied her harder. Her lips were blistered badly. She had been at it for a while. The bartender patiently held out the cigarette, grin never leaving his face, until she finally sighed and took it. He produced a lighter and she took a drag. She began to cough violently, gagging too. And I decided to chime in. Hey man, she doesn't look so hot, and I really don't think that she needs another smoke. She looks like she's dying of thirst too. Call the elevator, man. She's had enough, I think. The bartender turned his smile on me. Who? Old Nancy here? Nah, Nancy's a trooper, man. Smokes a couple of packs a day. And as far as her thirst, well, she knew this place was a thirsty sort of dive before she walked into the door. But she wanted to be here. She's getting exactly what she wanted. I walked over to Nancy and placed my hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, if you want to get out of here, I'll walk you over to the elevator. You don't look so great right now. I tried to sound as concerned as a 21-year-old could sound. Nancy looked at me and smiled. Oh, I'm fine. Just fine, she said, but her mouth quivered as she spoke. The bartender was watching us like a hawk, still smiling, but his smile no longer looked so friendly. Everything okay? He asked, beaming like a used car salesman. And Nancy shakily replied yes. The bartender turned around, and at that second, Nancy gripped my arm, pulled me into the smog that was her breath, and whispered, "Leave while you can." So low that I almost missed it. Her breath was like a chimney. She must have been chain-smoking for days. I smoked, and so do most of my friends, and even on nights when we would chain-smoke and pound booze until the sun rose, none of us were ever that toxic. I walked over to the man in the business suit, and he at least appeared sane. Hey, sir, I think that lady over there needs some help. The man looked at me and laughed. We all need help, kid. We're in hell, after all, he shouted. And as he did this, I looked over at the goth girl, just in time to see her begin to cut herself. Deep and hard from the looks of it. The plain-dressed man sitting next to her began to laugh in a high-pitched tone, almost a giggle, and that was when I noticed that he was playing with himself. Only not in the sense that we all do at home. No, his was raw, bloody, torn away in places, but he just kept going at it. Hey, stop that! Look what you're doing to yourselves! I screamed at them. And they looked at me, and I noticed that the girl was crying but also smiling. Her eyes were practically begging to her self-inflicted pain to stop, yet she kept cutting. I had seen enough. I reached over and I attempted to pull the knife out of her hand, and just then I felt a strong grip on my shoulder, stronger than anything I'd ever felt in my life. It was the bartender. He had come around the bar to grab me. No! No, sir! Every patron in hell gets to enjoy their treats without judgment. After all, judgment has already been passed. We exist beyond that now.
Let her cut. She loves it after all. Can't you see that she loves it? She is smiling from ear to ear.
The bartender dragged me back to my stool, and with great speed, was somehow back behind the bar again. Now, you wanted secrets, right, Kurt? You were bored and wanted more. That's what you came for. Now drink your drink before I beat your fucking face in. Through all of this, he never stopped smiling. He slammed a glass before me. A murky liquid was inside. And he grabbed my arm and began to squeeze. The pain becoming unbearable, my mind began to race. This was no bar. This was something, but not a bar. I wasn't ready to believe that I was actually in hell, but I knew that I was somewhere bad.
Drink your drink, sir!
He screamed again, and fearing that I would pass out from the pain, I slammed down the liquid in front of me. It tasted horrible. I couldn't describe it then, but I can't now. But it was fierce. And then he let go of me. And suddenly the room got much hotter. The light began to flicker, and suddenly I was afflicted by knowledge. Things that I didn't want to know. Things that no one would want to know. My mom and dad had an affair. And the man that I had grown up calling dad was in fact not my father at all. I had a brother who had died. One that I never knew. My boss at work hated me. My grandfather committed suicide. All these years I just thought that he died naturally. My mom, she was going to abort me, but changed her mind because she couldn't afford it. I was going to die alone. My wife, a woman that I would meet in 6 years and fall madly in love with, would die in a car crash with my 3-year-old son in the back seat. And there was nothing I could do to change this. I would go blind in my 60s from a work-related accident. There were currently 34 people in the world right now, some who I thought of as friends who wanted me to die. They hated me. And no one, not my mother, not my father, no one had ever loved me. At all. Those were just a few of the secrets that suddenly hit me. There were thousands, maybe millions more, but by then my mind couldn't process them all. There were some things about me, things about people that I knew that were so dark that I am thankful that I cannot remember them. Because to dwell on them for even a second longer would have brought on madness. Frantically, I looked around the bar. The woman, Nancy, was still smoking. Only her throat was on fire. A small red glow smoldering right in the middle of her throat. She was clearly in the worst pain of her existence, but she continued to take puff after puff of her cigarette. Each time that she did, the glow on her throat would get brighter. I looked straight ahead in the mirror behind the bar, seeing the gore fest that had begun behind me. However, what took my attention was the small, black figure standing directly to my right. He was maybe 5 feet tall. Its skin was jet black. The only thing that stood out was its eyes. They were human eyes, but bright, not glowing, just bright enough to stand out from the onyx of its face. It had small horns on its head, and it had a very white, very sharp teeth. And somehow I knew this was Din, and I was in his house. I looked towards the door, but it was gone, and the heat continued to get worse. The secrets were still popping in my mind, each worse than the one before. Entire dimensions of my soul were being revealed to me. All of it horrible. And just then my cell phone rang. The ringtone. Something from my world, something from above. It grabbed my attention, and in that moment the secret slowed down a bit. And I looked down, and it was 4 a.m. Mike was calling to check up on me. His name, Mike, yes. I have a friend named Mike, my best friend. The more I focused on things that were real, the more stable things became around me. The secrets were almost stopping now. The macabre scene around me was slowing down too. Nancy was back to just smoking again. The goth girl wasn't cutting in the sinister face of Den. It had also retreated just for a bit. Mike, my oldest friend, yes. We grew up together. We rode bikes together, we had sleepovers and pizza parties, and the more that I focused on the real world, if I could just... The door was back, and I bolted for it.
Stop! You had your chance to back out!
Screamed the bartender, and I looked back just in time to see him leap over the bar behind me. I shot through the door and back into the tiny, impossibly hot hallway. The bartender burst through the door, and I did the only thing that I could think of. If thinking about the real world weakened this place, then perhaps a real link to the real world would break it. I hit answer on my cell phone, and the voice of my best friend, who was calling me from the safety of his apartment, greeted my ears. I could even hear music in the background. Real music. Mike, call the cops! I'm in real trouble here! I screamed into the phone.
What? I could barely hear you, man. Your connection sucks.
He answered. And the bartender was still coming, still grinning. I had one last idea. I pushed speaker, and Mike's voice, a product of the real world, owned by someone who had not made a deal to enter some level of hell, flooded the hallway. The bartender stopped.
He's not allowed to know of this place, to have any contact with anyone being invited, even voice contact. It violates the Council of Nod.
And that was when the final blow to the bar from hell was delivered. I heard Mike, in his sleepy yet concerned voice, say,
"What's the Council of Nod?"
Contact had been made. Whatever rules governed this place had been broken. And suddenly the elevator came down. The bartender, still smiling, looked down at me.
Sorry, sir, but you have violated the rules. You are no longer welcome at this bar. Now please, leave.
Jodie was standing in the elevator, and I stood up and climbed in. The effects of the drink that I consumed were gone. No more secrets. And my phone had died. I guess calling from hell drains a battery. However, the effects were enough. And we rode up in silence. When we reached the surface, Jodie walked me out of the house and onto the stoop. And then she spoke. You may think that you won tonight, but you didn't. You had a chance to ride this elevator up as well as down. Your heart wants secrets instead of happiness, though. So it went down. You could have gone up, and everything you could ever possibly desired would have been yours. So go on. Feel proud. We like proud mortals, because the proud ones always find their way back to hell. Fuck you, Jodie, I replied, but did so as I was walking away. I didn't want to tempt those people any more than I had. And when I got home that night, I remembered almost all of the secrets. And over the years, they have slipped away. Slowly at first, then like a dream, I would wake up and more would be lost. I wrote down the ones that I listed here, because I didn't want to forget them all. However, when I read them now, they don't seem like secrets anymore. Just like weird lies. Of course, I called the police that very next day. I wanted to help the people down there. I had to dress up the story a bit. I told the cops that I was led there by Jodie after meeting her in the quarter. I left out the part about the place possibly being a level of hell and simply described it as a basement where people were being tortured. The cops got a warrant and they went in. The house was empty, as I said it was. However, there was no elevator found. The cops said that there was a large closet area that appears to have been an old elevator at one time, but it was long gone now. The house itself was still on the market. It had no owner. And for a few years, I would go down to Jackson Street around 2 a.m., hoping to catch Jodie luring another victim into the house. However, I never saw her again. And years went on, and I did marry, and no, my wife was never killed in a car accident. We don't have kids yet, though. Perhaps when I violated the contract, the Council of Nod or whatever, I somehow broke that cycle. I'll never know, but I will be careful. After I posted this, I burned the list of secrets that I had written down. Of course, I could always read them on here, but I won't. In time, hopefully I'll forget them too. I never confronted my mother about the abortion plan or asked who my real dad was. Those secrets seemed so real. But Satan is also called the father of lies for a reason. I'm not sure if Din is Satan or just a lesser version of him. But I doubt that Din is a very honest sort either. And so I post this with a warning. A warning to be careful when seeking out secrets. Some things are kept secret for a reason. And to know them is to know madness. My father once told me that something could frighten a person so badly that they could lose their voice. They would open their mouth and nothing would come out. No scream, no yell, no cry for help. Nothing. No matter how desperately they needed another human being to save them, their voice would fail. For some reason, this idea always stuck with me. And I would often wonder to myself, what would have to occur to produce such a profound reaction? Can something be that frightening? And recently I found the answer for myself. It was 6 months ago. I worked for a company which runs several nightclubs in the city where I live. A few weeks previous, I'd been promoted to assistant manager and given the task for opening a new bar, which would double as a nightclub after 11 p.m. I was excited about it. The job was a real step up the ladder for me. The club had been renovated thoroughly. It had been a bar nearly a decade before and in the busy part of town, increasing its chances of success. Stairs led down from 2 entrances to below street level. The club is basically a converted basement. There are 4 bars, and together they hold about 750 people legally at fire capacity, although we quite regularly exceeded that during my time. When the club was open at night, I had no problem working there. I liked the music and we had a pretty good crowd. Not too much trouble. It was when we shut during the day that I hated being there. Every Wednesday morning, we'd taken a delivery to be ready for the weekend, ordering in a couple of 100 cases of alcohol to keep everybody happy, owners and customers alike. And that was when I first noticed it. The silence of the place. Walking around the club during the day, a venue which was noisy and populated by hundreds of people each night, now quiet. I thought that it was this contrast, and the fact that it was underground, which made me feel uneasy. But now I know that it was something far more sinister. On delivery day, I'd always been first in the building, usually about an hour or so before the rest of the shift would turn up. They would take any delivery cases to the stockroom. Even the thought of that place makes me shudder. Anyone who frequented the club wouldn't have known. But behind one of the fire doors there was a long, dimly lit corridor with once white flaking walls which led to where thousands of pounds worth of spirits, beer, and other beverages sat locked up and tight. Part of my job was to walk from bar to bar each Wednesday morning and make sure nothing had been stolen during the night. An all too common event in the nightclub trade. Often staff members taking what they liked, thinking no one would notice. I suspect now that the reason I was given this duty was because the general manager, my boss, knew there was something wrong with the building and didn't have the guts to do it himself. And so I walked hesitantly between the 4 rooms which housed the different bars and dance floors, only to be presented with the strange emptiness, which was completely at odds with how the place should have been. Then, the moment I always dreaded, checking the stockroom. Each time I opened the fire door, which led into the long hallway, I was greeted by a cold draft of air which carried with it a stench of stale beer, a horrid musty smell which often made me feel queasy. It isn't an uncommon thing to encounter in a nightclub, especially where alcohol is stored. But that corridor always seemed to reek of it, more pronounced than anything else I had ever encountered. I walked slowly down the corridor, my footsteps echoing between the flaking white walls. And each time, the stale beer smell made its way towards me in the chilled air. And then, feeling nervous, I would fumble for my keys and open the door to the stockroom, which was in fact 2 rooms connected by an open doorway. I'd quickly switch on the lights and then leave as soon as everything seemed to be where it should be. This time was different. Before I'd even thought about getting my keys out, I noticed something unusual. A small fin of light squeezing its way between the double doors of the stockroom. The place always put me on edge, even though I had no real reason to be that way. But the unreasonableness of the sensation made me feel even more uncomfortable. I set my anxious feelings aside and unlocked the door, pushing them wide open. The first room seemed to be fine, as ordinary as it could be. Just cases of alcohol stocked neatly on pallets. As far as I could tell, nothing was missing or broken. And as I approached the open doorway to the second room, however, I heard a sound. Something unusual which made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. A hissing noise which stopped me in my tracks. And I paused for a moment, hesitant to continue, but then I rationalized it. The sound coming from the next room was surely CO2 seeping out from the canister. They were used to carbonate drinks, and it was with a sigh of relief that when I finally gathered up my nerves to enter the second room, I discovered that indeed one of them seemed to be leaking. The second room was narrower than the other, piled up cases of vodka partially obscuring my view of the source. When I squeezed past a couple of beer kegs, I found that one of the canisters had somehow unhooked from its line to the bars and was hissing out CO2. I walked over to it and turned the valve shut. It was then that a chill gripped me, and I froze to the spot. I turned the valve, shut it tight, but the hissing continued. And what was worse, it came from behind me, somewhere between me and the only exit. I don't know how, but with every fiber of my being, I knew something unearthly was in the room with me. I didn't want to turn around. I know this sounds strange, but like a child, I felt that if I didn't see what was there, I would be safe. Whether that was a conscious choice or if I was just paralyzed with fear, I'm uncertain. I stood staring at the closed valve of the canister, almost in disbelief, hoping that I would be left alone. And the hissing noise continued, but it had taken on another characteristic. No longer did it sound like gas seeping out into the air. There was now an organic quality to it, something subtle, like the wet hiss of a breath across tongue and through teeth. It pierced the silence of the room, oppressing all around it. Then it was joined by another sound, an echo, that of a footstep, and then another, and another. As each footfall filled my mind with impeding fear, the hissing, too, grew louder. The stockroom felt colder than usual, and the hissing drew nearer, the temperature continuing to plummet. I fought the impulse in my mind to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. My mind and body had refused to accept the reality of it, and in that denial, terror had found a home. It was then that the footsteps ceased, just as they stood right behind me. I'm not sure how long I stood in that silence. It stood behind me. It could have been seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Shivers swept across my body, and I noticed that the stench of stale beer had grown so potent that I felt sick to my stomach. And the hissing then blew in my ear. I tried to scream. I tried to yell. Nothing came. I just stood there, petrified. I was incapable of acting. And then the hiss was replaced by a sound even more chilling. A quiet, mocking laugh which lasted only for a moment, like someone smirked perversely under their breath at another's anguish. That somehow provoked a response in me. I was angry. Someone was trying to make a fool of me, perhaps one of my colleagues. I spun around only to see nothing and to be greeted by the cluttered emptiness of the stockroom. There was no one there. No noise. No laughing figure. Nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief as my numbness receded. But then the pallid shape of a man came rushing through the doorway from the other room. He lurched towards me, his hands outstretched, letting out a blood-curdling scream, his eyes filled with what I could only describe as hatred. It all happened so quickly, my only instinct was to avoid the touch of his languid skin. I tripped over in the process, and my back landed on the sharp spout of the metal beer keg, which gouged deep into my skin, tearing a muscle and causing excruciating pain. I looked up, dazed as the man ran straight into and then through the wall. And then I dragged myself to my feet. I could see no one. And I quickly stumbled out of the stockroom, knowing that I would never set foot in there again. I wish that I could provide some meaning of explanation for that terrifying event. Maybe the leaking CO2 had made me hallucinate somehow. I just don't know. All I can say is that the general manager told me that other staff members had experienced strange goings-on there in the stockroom. The sense of being watched, footsteps, and that he himself had heard a strange hissing noise there. Well, that's the end of it, really. I didn't last too long after that. And within a week, I handed in my notice. I always wondered how frightened a person would have to be to lose their voice. And on that day, in that cold and cramped room, I found out my limits, and I hope to never test them again.